And then I opened my eyes, and there were 6 paramedics in my living room.
I was embarrassed for Shashi to say what she intended to say.
First and foremost, I want no further conflict with him. You tell him from me that he can live. Vincent, will you stop?
Since his big break in 1971, roles have flooded in for Al Pacino. When The Godfather was first released, it became a cult classic, catapulting its cast into global stardom. However, despite the film's success, tensions ran high behind the scenes, especially between 2 of its major stars, Pacino and Marlon Brando. Now, after all these years, Pacino is finally revealing what really went down between him and Brando. Pacino's turbulent childhood. Since his breakout performance in 1971's The Godfather, Al Pacino has cemented his status as one of the greatest actors of all time. Born Alfredo James Pacino on April 25, 1940, in New York City, Pacino was raised in the tough streets of the South Bronx. Life wasn't easy, but he was surrounded by strong women, his mother, aunt, and grandmother, along with his grandfather, who all played a major role in shaping him. Pacino's early years were difficult. His grandmother was the dominant figure in the household, with his mother coming second. Since his mother had him at a young age, he owed a great deal to that time in his life and to the family that raised him. Though his family didn't push him toward acting, Pacino admitted they never outright discouraged him either. Instead, they quietly accepted his passion, allowing him to pursue his dreams. Before becoming the Hollywood legend he is today, Pacino sharpened his skills at the Herbert Berghof studio in New York City, where he first took an interest in theater. His journey took a sharp turn when he met Charlie Lawton, not in a classroom but in a bar in New York City, when he was just 17. That chance encounter led to a good friendship, with Lawton eventually becoming one of his greatest mentors. Determined to refine his craft, Pacino later joined Lee Strasberg's prestigious Actors Studio in 1967, where he immersed himself in method acting. He performed in productions across New York and Boston, steadily making a name for himself in the theater world. His Broadway debut came in 1969 with Does the Tiger Wear a Necktie?, a performance that won him a Tony Award and set the stage for his meteoric rise. Looking back on his journey, Pacino credited 3 people for shaping his career: Charlie Lawton, Lee Strasberg, and Martin Bregman. He described Lawton as his greatest friend and mentor, while also acknowledging Strasberg's influence and Bregman's impact on his Hollywood career. Bregman, who later became his manager and produced several of his films, was instrumental in securing Pacino's first major movie role. In 1971, Pacino took on a career-defining part in The Panic in Needle Park, playing a heroin addict in a raw, unforgettable performance. That film marked the beginning of a Hollywood career that would soon change the industry forever. The role that brought him success. Al Pacino's big break came in 1972 when he took on the role of Michael Corleone in Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather. The performance earned him his first Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor, but he chose to skip the ceremony. Years later, in a 2022 interview with the New York Times, he clarified that his absence wasn't meant as a protest. Instead, he described himself at the time as being somewhat rebellious. Pacino returned as Michael Corleone in The Godfather Part 2, 1974, and The Godfather Part 3, 1990, further solidifying his place in Hollywood history. But during the filming of the first movie in 1971, a crush was brewing. Diane Keaton admitted to People that she had a crush on Pacino. This crush eventually blossomed into a relationship, with Keaton recalling that she was completely captivated by Pacino, describing him as charming, hilarious, and a non-stop talker. She also noted that there was something about him that felt like a lost orphan, a mix of brilliance and madness. And, of course, she found him absolutely gorgeous. However, Pacino had no interest in marriage, which eventually led to the relationship's end. Keaton later admitted that she had worked hard to make it work, but ultimately went about it in an imperfect way. Following The Godfather, Pacino's career skyrocketed. He starred in Serpico, 1973, earning another Oscar nomination and winning a Golden Globe for his performance. In 1975, Dog Day Afternoon brought him yet another Oscar nod. Even as his film career flourished, he remained committed to the stage, winning his second Tony Award in 1977 for the basic training of Pavlo Hummel. In 1983, he took on one of his most iconic roles, Tony Montana in Scarface. He then starred as Detective Frank Keller in Sea of Love, 1989, alongside Ellen Barkin. His portrayal of the villainous Big Boy Caprice in Dick Tracy, 1990, directed by Warren Beatty, earned him yet another Oscar nomination. By 1992, Pacino finally claimed his long-awaited Academy Award for Scent of a Woman, in which he played a blind man who embarks on a memorable adventure in New York City over Thanksgiving. The role also earned him his second Golden Globe. Over the years, he continued collecting accolades, winning Golden Globes for Angels in America, 2004, and You Don't Know Jack, 2011. In 2001, he was honored with the prestigious Cecil B. DeMille Award for his outstanding contributions to entertainment. In 1996, Pacino made his directorial debut with Looking for Richard, a hybrid documentary exploring Shakespeare's Richard III, a role he had played on Broadway in 1979. The film featured an all-star cast, including Winona Ryder, Alec Baldwin, Kevin Spacey, Kevin Kline, James Earl Jones, and Vanessa Redgrave. During the 1990s, Pacino entered a relationship with actress Beverly D'Angelo, who was still legally married at the time. However, her ex-husband actually encouraged her to pursue Pacino. After dating for several years, they welcomed twins, Anton and Olivia, in 2001. Though their romantic relationship ended soon after the children's birth, D'Angelo later reflected that the greatest gift Pacino ever gave her was making her a mother. While his personal life was unfolding in unexpected ways, Pacino's professional journey was shaped by encounters with legends, none more influential than Marlon Brando. Al Pacino and Marlon Brando's first meeting. Al Pacino never imagined that lunch with Marlon Brando would turn into a masterclass in both acting and unpredictability. When Francis Ford Coppola insisted that they share a meal to build an authentic father-son dynamic for The Godfather, Pacino wasn't thrilled. He respected Brando immensely, perhaps too much. To him, the legendary actor wasn't just a peer, he was a myth. The idea of sitting across from the greatest living actor of their time was daunting, and Pacino admitted he would have preferred to avoid it altogether. Pacino explained that he had grown up idolizing actors like Brando, larger-than-life figures such as Clark Gable and Cary Grant. To him, these stars belonged to an era when fame still carried an air of mystery, unlike the reality stars and influencers of today. The prospect of sitting across from such a legend made him feel like an imposter. The lunch itself turned out to be anything but ordinary. Rather than taking place at a restaurant or a catering table on set, it happened while Brando was lying in a hospital bed, with Pacino in the bed beside him. The scene they were filming involved Michael Corleone visiting his ailing father in an empty hospital, and Coppola had arranged for their lunch to take place there. Brando started the conversation by asking Pacino simple questions about his background, where he was from, how long he had been acting. But Pacino found it difficult to focus because Brando was eating chicken cacciatore with his bare hands. As Pacino recalled, his co-star's hands and face were covered in red sauce, and that became the only thing he could concentrate on. Staring at the legendary actor, Pacino found himself mesmerized by the bizarre situation. Brando was getting messier by the second, and he couldn't help but wonder what would happen to the half-eaten chicken. Would Brando ask him to throw it away? But before he could figure it out, the leftover chicken had mysteriously disappeared, without Brando even getting up. Then Brando fixed Pacino with a look, one that seemed to challenge him, as if silently asking what was going through his mind. But all Pacino could think about was what Brando intended to do with his sauce-covered hands. Should he offer him a napkin? Before he could act, Brando stunned him by casually smearing his hands across the white hospital bedsheets, leaving streaks of red sauce everywhere, all while continuing their conversation as if nothing had happened. Pacino was shocked. He had been raised to be polite and respectful, and the sight of someone, especially Brando, effortlessly making such a mess completely rewired his understanding of movie star behavior. He thought to himself that perhaps, when one reached that level of fame, they could do anything. When the lunch was over, Brando looked at him with his gentle eyes and reassured him, telling him that he was going to be all right. In hindsight, Pacino wasn't entirely sure how he had responded. He assumed he had at least said thank you. But looking back, he wished he had asked Brando to clarify. What exactly did he mean by all right? Why did Al Pacino boycott the Oscars in 1973? After The Godfather premiered in 1972, its critical and commercial success made it a front-runner for the following year's Academy Awards. The film was not only a cinematic masterpiece, but also a box office phenomenon, raking in $1 million a day on a modest $6 million budget. When the Oscar nominations were announced, The Godfather secured an impressive 11 nods, including Best Picture for Albert S. Ruddy, Best Actor in a Leading Role for Brando, and Best Adapted Screenplay for Francis Ford Coppola and Mario Puzo. These nominations turned into victories, solidifying the film's legacy. However, the acting categories sparked controversy. James Caan, Robert Duvall, and Al Pacino were all nominated for Best Supporting Actor, a categorization that Pacino found insulting. Unlike Caan and Duvall, who might have seen the recognition as an honor, Pacino felt he had delivered a performance worthy of Best Actor in a Leading Role, a category Brando ultimately won. His frustration was understandable. Pacino's screen time as Michael Corleone exceeded that of Brando's Don Vito Corleone. Feeling slighted, Pacino made the bold decision to skip the 1973 Academy Awards entirely. Decades later, he has offered more insight into his absence. "I was somewhat uncomfortable with being in that situation, being in that world," he admitted. At the time, he was performing Richard III on stage in Boston. But in retrospect, he sees that as an excuse. "I just was afraid to go," he revealed. Pacino reflected on his mindset at the time, describing himself as being caught in the whirlwind of sudden fame. "I was young, younger than even my years," he said. "It was the old shot-out-of-a-cannon syndrome, and it's connected to drugs and those kinds of things, which I was engaged in back there, and I think that had a lot to do with it. I was just unaware of things back then." Ironically, Pacino's absence from the ceremony was largely overshadowed by Brando's headline-making protest. When Brando won Best Actor, he refused to attend, sending activist Sachin Littlefeather in his place to decline the award and speak out against Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans. Even on the night Pacino chose to stay away, Brando managed to dominate the narrative once again. Beyond personal disappointment, Pacino's boycott of the Oscars was also fueled by a broader sentiment of rebellion in Hollywood. He acknowledged that he had entered a rebellious phase in his life and noted that he was not alone in resisting Hollywood's status quo. "I was at that stage in my life where I was somewhat more or less rebellious," he said. "I don't think Bob De Niro went to one of them. Marlon didn't go. Look, Marlon gave back the Oscar. They were rebelling against the Hollywood thing. That kind of thing was in the air." The drama between Pacino and Marlon Brando. Al Pacino and Marlon Brando's collaboration on The Godfather in 1972 became one of the most celebrated moments in cinematic history. Yet, despite their phenomenal performances, they did not receive equal recognition at the Academy Awards. And this, many people believed, could have led to animosity between the co-stars. When the Oscars rolled around, Brando was nominated and won for Best Actor in a Leading Role, while Pacino, who had more screen time, was placed in the Best Supporting Actor category. This disparity sparked speculation that tension existed between the two actors, with many believing that Pacino resented Brando's nomination and victory. Rumors of a feud only grew as time passed, but according to Pacino himself, they couldn't have been further from the truth. Speaking to The Hollywood Reporter during an interview with David Rubenstein for New York's 92nd Street Why People Who Inspire Us series, he was visibly surprised when asked about it. "How does a story like that get out? I wasn't upset. Are you kidding me?" he responded. His reaction made it clear that he found the rumors absurd, if not outright laughable. But that wasn't the only controversy surrounding Pacino's name that night. Another widely circulated theory suggested that his absence from the 1973 Oscars was a silent protest against his nomination in the supporting category instead of leading. Over the years, many assumed that Pacino deliberately skipped the event out of frustration. However, he was quick to set the record straight, explaining that there was no truth to this assumption either. Meanwhile, The Godfather wasn't the only film tied to such behind-the-scenes speculation. Robert Duvall, who played Tom Hagen in the franchise, made headlines years later when he refused to return for The Godfather Part 3, bluntly stating, "I think everybody did it for money." While his reason for stepping away was refreshingly honest, it showed how The Godfather series was not immune to conflicts, albeit ones unrelated to the supposed Pacino-Brando rift. Another layer of intrigue emerged when Pacino addressed the broader implications of Brando's legacy. Some actors had even modeled their performances after him, with Avengers star Josh Brolin admitting he found inspiration in Brando's elusive and complex roles, particularly when portraying Thanos. Despite all the theories and assumptions that surrounded the Oscars that year, Pacino left no room for doubt. There was never any rivalry between him and Brando. As he put it, the rumors were nothing more than fiction, a narrative created by those eager to find drama where none exists. The one actor Marlon Brando truly disliked. For all his brilliance on screen, Marlon Brando was notoriously difficult to work with. His demands were often unreasonable. His reluctance to memorize lines led to cue cards being scattered across sets and even taped to other actors, and his unpredictable behavior made him a headache for studios. By the latter years of his career, many major filmmakers had written him off entirely. Given his history of clashes in Hollywood, it's hardly surprising that Brando harbored a deep-seated grudge against another big-name actor of his time, Burt Reynolds. However, unlike some of Brando's other disputes, this feud was largely one-sided. It burnt so intensely, though, that it led to Brando blocking Reynolds from being cast in The Godfather, a decision that completely altered the course of film history. By the 1970s, Burt Reynolds was already a major star. But despite his box office appeal, he had a habit of turning down roles that could have elevated his career even further. Over the years, he famously rejected offers to play James Bond, Han Solo, and the male lead in Pretty Woman. But perhaps the most surprising missed opportunity was the role of Michael Corleone in The Godfather, a decision that, as it turns out, was not entirely his own. During The Godfather's early casting phase, director Francis Ford Coppola was convinced that Reynolds had the perfect blend of charm and intensity to portray Michael, the reluctant heir to the Corleone crime family. However, the film's biggest star, Marlon Brando, felt otherwise. Brando was so opposed to Reynolds joining the project that he threatened to walk away from his role as Vito Corleone if the studio went through with the casting. Not wanting to lose his lead actor, Coppola and the producers expanded their search for Michael, ultimately landing on the then-rising star, Al Pacino. It's hard to imagine anyone but Pacino as Michael Corleone now, but the fact that Reynolds came so close to landing the role makes Brando's opposition all the more intriguing. What made him so determined to keep Reynolds out of The Godfather? To understand Brando's animosity toward Reynolds, one must look back to the late 1950s and early 1960s, when Reynolds was still a fresh face in Hollywood. As he started gaining traction in the industry, many people noted his striking resemblance to a young Marlon Brando. This comparison alone may have irked Brando, but what truly set him off was an episode of The Twilight Zone that aired in May 1963, titled The Bard. Tawan. The episode featured Reynolds playing an actor whose exaggerated performance style was a clear parody of Brando's distinct accent and mannerisms. Whether intended as a light-hearted jab or not, Brando saw it as a direct insult. He never forgave Reynolds for what he perceived as an open mockery of his persona. As time passed, Brando's resentment only deepened. So when the opportunity arose for Reynolds to star alongside him in The Godfather, Brando made sure it didn't happen. His influence was powerful enough that Reynolds was never seriously considered again, paving the way for Pacino to take on the iconic role instead. Brando's personal grudge against Reynolds may have altered cinematic history, keeping Reynolds out of one of the greatest films ever made while cementing Al Pacino's rise to superstardom. Given how perfectly Pacino embodied the character of Michael Corleone, it's safe to say things worked out for the best. But it's fascinating to consider how one actor's lingering resentment over a decade-old TV sketch shaped the casting of a film that remains a cornerstone of Hollywood history. Burt Reynolds wasn't exactly thrilled about the constant comparisons to Marlon Brando either. In fact, the story goes that he eventually grew his signature mustache in the 1970s to further distance himself from the legendary method actor. As for missing out on the role of Michael Corleone, Reynolds didn't seem too bothered. After all, The Godfather wasn't the only major film released in 1972. That same year, he starred in Deliverance, a thriller that became a classic in its own right. However, The Godfather wasn't the only project where Brando actively blocked Reynolds from being cast. Brando blocks Reynolds again, this time in Apocalypse Now. A few years after The Godfather, Francis Ford Coppola once again considered casting Reynolds, this time in Apocalypse Now. However, just like before, Marlon Brando had already secured a leading role, playing Colonel Kurtz, and he was absolutely against the idea of Reynolds joining the film. If Brando's opposition to Reynolds in The Godfather was subtle behind-the-scenes maneuvering, his reaction to Apocalypse Now was anything but. An audio recording from the set captured Brando's immediate response upon hearing that Reynolds might be cast. The legendary actor didn't hold back, calling Reynolds the epitome of something that makes me want to throw up, and going even further by saying he worships at the temple of his own narcissism. For someone as notoriously difficult as Brando, that was an especially ironic statement. At the time, Brando had shown up to Apocalypse Now overweight at nearly 300 pounds, completely unprepared, refusing to memorize lines, and having never even read Heart of Darkness, the Joseph Conrad novel upon which the film was based. He also had no interest in working with his co-star Dennis Hopper, creating even more tension on set. But Brando wasn't done taking shots at Reynolds. In the same recorded conversation, Brando accused Reynolds of being fake, using a bizarre anecdote to justify his disgust. He recalled seeing Reynolds on TV in what he believed was a staged moment of affection. Brando's perception of Reynolds as disingenuous only deepened his resentment. Whether this specific story was exaggerated or not, it was clear that Brando viewed Reynolds as someone who prioritized fame and vanity, something Brando himself had become increasingly disillusioned with in Hollywood. Reynolds' career moves on. Much like how Reynolds rebounded from losing the Godfather role with The Deliverance, he bounced back again after Apocalypse Now with another major hit. In 1977, the same year Coppola's Vietnam War epic was released, Reynolds starred in the smash comedy Smokey and the Bandit. Opening the same weekend as Star Wars, the film solidified Reynolds as a comedic superstar and proved that his strengths lay in light-hearted, charismatic roles rather than the dark, brooding characters Brando was known for. From that point forward, Reynolds and Brando rarely crossed paths. But that doesn't mean Reynolds never addressed their strange feud or Brando's open contempt for him. How did Burt Reynolds respond to Marlon Brando? Burt Reynolds may not have publicly lashed out at Marlon Brando, but he certainly found a way to get some subtle revenge. After learning that Brando had blocked him from The Godfather, Reynolds took a jab at the legendary actor in a 1980 Saturday Night Live sketch. The skit, a parody interview, featured SNL star Gilda Radner as Baba Wawa, a spoof of journalist Barbara Walters, trying to conduct a serious conversation with a fictionalized Marlon Brando, played by Reynolds himself. The joke? Brando spent the entire interview lying in bed and stuffing his face with food, poking fun at the actor's well-documented weight gain and eccentric behavior. It was a light-hearted dig, but one that surely didn't go unnoticed by those familiar with their feud. Despite the tension between them, Reynolds never outright trashed Brando in public. Interestingly, Brando didn't either. His harshest words about Reynolds were caught on a recording and leaked rather than being aired publicly. When asked about their long-running feud decades later, in one of his final interviews in 2019 with Andy Cohen, Reynolds gave a response that might have irritated Brando even more than any insult. "No, I was very flattered. I was flattered, he was upset." With that, Reynolds seemed to make peace with the decades-old rivalry. While some Hollywood feuds faded with time, others left a lasting impact. Burt Reynolds and Marlon Brando's long-running rivalry never found resolution. But in the end, Reynolds seemed to look back on it with a sense of humor rather than bitterness. Outliving Brando by nearly 2 decades, he ultimately viewed their conflict as little more than a footnote in his career. How Pacino went broke twice. For Al Pacino, however, the challenges he faced went beyond professional rivalries. His struggles extended into his finances. Despite starring in some of the most iconic films in Hollywood history, Pacino's success on the big screen didn't always translate to financial stability. In his new memoir, Sonny Boy, he reveals that he went broke not just once, but twice, proving that even the biggest stars aren't immune to financial pitfalls. Despite playing the lead role of Michael Corleone, Pacino was still relatively unknown at the time. Marlon Brando, playing his on-screen father, received most of the attention and a significantly larger paycheck. Pacino, on the other hand, earned only $35,000 for his performance, which was far below what a leading actor in a major studio film would typically make. After paying his agents and managers, he was left with very little and found himself relying on financial support from his then-girlfriend, Jill Clayburgh. His financial situation improved with The Godfather Part II in 1974, where he became the undisputed star. The success of films like Dog Day Afternoon and Justice for All followed, but they were interspersed with commercial disappointments. His earnings fluctuated, and by the 1980s, he found himself in trouble once again. The decade brought fewer acting roles, but Scarface, in 1983, became a major financial lifeline. Pacino describes it as the most lucrative film of his career, with residuals that still provide him with income today. However, even the success of Scarface wasn't enough to keep him financially stable. With an expensive lifestyle that included a country home and lavish spending, his bank account started to dwindle. By the mid-1980s, he had only around $90,000 left, which wasn't nearly enough to sustain him. Poor financial management also played a role in his money problems. While he acknowledges that accountants and managers made questionable decisions, he ultimately blames himself for not understanding how money worked. He had been placed into a tax shelter that collapsed, and while others may have taken advantage of him, he takes responsibility for his own financial mistakes. During a meeting with an entertainment lawyer, his then-girlfriend Diane Keaton reached her breaking point. Frustrated with his lack of financial awareness, she bluntly called him out in front of the attorney. She dismissed any notion that he was simply an artist struggling with money, and instead labeled him an idiot for his poor financial decisions. Her frustration was clear. Pacino was a major star, yet he was in financial ruin. That moment served as a wake-up call. With Keaton's encouragement, he actively sought out a new project, leading him to star in Sea of Love in 1989. The film was a commercial and critical success, marking his comeback and pulling him out of financial trouble. It was a crucial moment, especially after the massive failure of Revolution in 1985, which had barely made any money against a massive budget. Pacino's struggles with money highlight the reality that even the biggest stars aren't immune to financial hardships. Despite his setbacks, he managed to rebuild his career